Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and discusses 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Alexander Schmemann lived from 1921 to 1983. He was a proto-presbyter and leading theologian of the Russian Orthodox Church. He was born in Tallinn, Estonia, to emigres from St. Petersburg. His family had fled Russia after the October Revolution. When still a child, his family moved to Paris. There he was educated. During his preparation for the priesthood at the St. Sergius Institute, he studied under Sergei Buglakov, but was also influenced by Catholic theologians such as Jean d'Agnelou and Louis Bouillet. In 1946, he was ordained a priest. 5 years later, he moved with his family to the United States to teach at the St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. He had been invited by George Florovsky, and there he taught church history and liturgical theology. He was an observer at the Second Vatican Council, and for 30 years his homilies were transmitted by Radio Liberty to the Soviet Union, where they won the admiration of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Schmemann was also active in establishing the Orthodox Church in America, which was granted autocephaly by the Patriarch of Moscow in 1970. An influential proponent of liturgical theology, his writings continue to be widely read and admired. In this interview, Andrew T.J. Kaetheler offers an introduction to Schmemann and his work. Andrew T.J. Kaetheler is Academic Dean and Associate Professor of Theology at Catholic Pacific College. He is co-editor of Between Being and Time, From Ontology to Eschatology, published by Fortress Academic, and is the author of The Eschatological Person, Alexander Schmemann and Josef Ratzinger in Dialogue, published by Cascade Books. The books discussed in this episode are, first, For the Life of the World, Sacraments and Orthodoxy, by Father Alexander Schmemann. Second, O Death, Where is Thy Sting, by Alexander Schmemann. Third, Great Lent, Journey to Pascha, by Alexander Schmemann. Fourth, The Journals of Father Alexander Schmemann, 1973 to 1983. And fifth, The Eschatological Person, Alexander Schmemann and Josef Ratzinger in Dialogue, by Andrew T.J. Kaetheler. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode, and if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Andrew Kaetheler, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Who was Alexander Schmemann?
Yeah, Alexander Schmemann was 20th century thinker, born in the 1920s. And he was a Russian immigrant. His family moved to Paris. He grew up in Paris and grew up in an Orthodox home and became an Orthodox priest and scholar. And fairly young, at a fairly young age, he moved to the States, and he was asked to come teach at St. Vladimir's in New York, and he moved with his family and spent the rest of his life teaching there. He was the dean for most of that time, and died in the 80s in America.
And you've written on Schmemann. What drew you to study him?
Yeah, great question. It's a little bit of a funny story. I have a friend who's a theologian named Hans Boersma, and Hans Boersma, I had sat down with him one day for lunch, and I said to him, Hans, what are 5 books every theologian must read? And so he listed a number of books, such as Henri de Lubac's Catholicism and I think Augustine's Confessions and a bunch of other books, and one of them was Alexander Schmemann's For the Life of the World. And so I went to the bookstore and pulled all the books off the shelf. And I was a new teacher at the time. I was teaching at a university in Lithuania. I didn't have much time on my hands, and all the books seemed too long except for The Life of the World. So I bought For the Life of the World and began reading it. And by the time I was done, I finished it. And I remember my wife, I think I was sitting in a car and I finished it. My wife came back in. She was shopping and came back in. And I said, if I ever do a PhD, I'm going to do a PhD on Alexander Schmemann. And that's what happened. And so then I spent 4 years of my time in St. Andrews looking at Schmemann alongside of Joseph Ratzinger.
Schmemann was an influential proponent of liturgical theology and influenced Catholics such as Father Aidan Kavanagh and David Fagerberg, who have written extensively on the same theme. For Schmemann, the liturgy is not just one of the many sources of theological reflection. It's not just another locus theologicus. What exactly does he mean by liturgical theology?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's a great question. David Fagerberg puts it very well, is that the liturgy is prima theologia. This is the heart of theology. And all theology comes out of the liturgy. And maybe this sort of simple way of thinking about it is in terms of the Latin phrase lex orandi, lex credendi. For Schmemann, there's no theology outside of the liturgy. And I think that's a pretty easy thing to substantiate, because we know, for example, that the early church was baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, not having a developed Trinitarian theology. The theology came later. And so everything begins from worship. And fundamentally, you see this in the way I think Schmemann talks, and the way that Schmemann writes, that everything leads back to worship. Everything. So, I mean, if you think of someone like a Hans Urs von Balthasar, theology begins from the knees. Yeah, very much so. But those knees, this isn't some sort of individualistic pietism. This is within the life of the church. Everything is received from the church, then contemplated, and systematic theology is secondary theology that comes out of our experience of worship.
Arguably, Schmemann's most important academic work is his doctoral dissertation, Introduction to Liturgical Theology. It's not made your shortlist. Is it because it's too technical and academic?
Yeah. That and his book, The Eucharist. I thought both of them are quite technical. A little, well, the latter is there's a lot of swirling around as he's trying to get to the heart of what the Eucharist is. With the first, with his PhD work, it's more of a historical work. And I think most of that actually comes out in his other books, but in ways that are more digestible.
Schmemann appreciated and acknowledged the contribution of various Catholic theologians to a renewed sense of the primacy of the liturgy. Nevertheless, as a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, he did not accept that the Bishop of Rome is the perpetual and visible principle of the foundation, perpetual and visible principle and foundation of the unity both of the bishops and of the multitude of the faithful. Moreover, he makes the common Orthodox criticism that the Western Church has gone astray because of its embrace of rationalism. Most of what Schmemann writes is valid and illuminating for Catholics. What should Catholics not take away from his words?
That's a big question. Schmemann's very critical of the West, and he often says that Orthodoxy has been held captive by Western thought. And I would say he caricatures Western thought. And the unfortunate thing is, in all of his works, besides his PhD dissertation, he doesn't acknowledge his engagement, or minimally acknowledges his engagement with Catholic thinkers. And so people like Danielou, Henri de Lubac, who else would come to mind? Somebody like, Bouillet. Yeah, Bouillet is very important for him. These don't, they're not brought up again in his other books. And so it sounds like he's discovered these great flaws within Western thought, but they're the same critiques that these ressourcement theologians are making. And they're sort of called back to thinking liturgically. They're called back to the Eastern Fathers. Their move away from a sort of manualist tradition. And so one has to be a little wary of Schmemann's critique of the West and realize that actually his critique of the West is inspired by Western thinkers. This is not something that the Western thinkers weren't aware of, some of the own issues within their own tradition. And so he has I would say, a misread of somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas. He will repeatedly set out Western theology as being enslaved or imprisoned by a sort of juridical approach to thinking, and a type of sort of, as you said, rationalism. He's very wary of rationalism because he thinks that being a liturgical theologian, we need to encounter the joy of Christ in the present. We're not Gnostics. And so he sees a tendency within Catholic theology to rationalize, to get stuck in the head, to be too juridical, and to think in terms of obligation. So we think in terms of rules, and he wants to draw his readers back to sort of the spirit of the liturgy, to use Guardini's title. And so as Catholics, I think Schmemann is really important for us because the things he does highlight, which I think he learned from many Western thinkers, are important, and we can succumb to these issues. So for example, he's quite concerned about something like transubstantiation and what the West has done with transubstantiation. And he says, what we've done in a way is we've defined it. And once we've defined it, this is a way I would speak to Catholics and say, once we've defined it, we think we can walk away from it. Got it, transubstantiation, know what the Eucharist is, move on. And Schmemann's so good for us because he reminds us that this is the great mystery that we can never walk away from. And what's so central for Schmemann is that the Eucharist, all the sacraments, but the Eucharist being the sacrament par excellence, is epiphanic. It reveals, it's revelatory. So it's not this sui generis thing that there's nothing like it in the world, so we can never understand it. It's just this miracle that we accept by faith. But he says, no, if you enter into the mystery of the Eucharist, it reveals all reality. And so we can't just say, hey, we've defined it, we move on. No, the definition just leads into a greater mystery. And we need to begin to think in a Eucharistic manner. So that's what's really positive, and I think really important for us as Catholics. But I think the danger is that he misconstrues how we perceive things as Catholics. He kind of gives the worst case scenario of Catholicism, or one very specific read of Catholicism. So we need to be aware of that when we read Schmemann.
Theologians are not known for their elegant prose and readability. However, like various other 20th century Orthodox theologians, Schmemann is an engaging writer whose works are accessible. To what do you attribute this?
Yeah, that's great. I think that's why I fell in love with Schmemann in many ways. My PhD supervisor would say he has a lot of purple prose that needs some semantic hygiene at times, but I love his writing. I think he writes in a very poetic manner, a very inspiring manner. It leads you not into academic exercise, but it leads you into prayer in many ways. And so, why is that? Well, he was a lover of poetry. And, one of the books I recommended is his journals. And unfortunately, his journals have been edited. The English versions So you don't have as much about poetry in them. But in the Russian version, I've been told, I do not read Russian, but I've been told he has much reflection on poetry. And his wife figured that North Americans, Westerners, English-speaking people would not be able to appreciate Father Schmemann's poetic reflections. But I think this being shaped by poetry, by he loved novelists. He liked the French novelists. He quotes people like Bernanos. I think this came out in his writing, and I think maybe it's a very accurate reflection of his theology, in that his form matched his content, which is, the liturgy is beautiful. The liturgy is not this sort of rational, argument, set out A, B, therefore C sort of thing, but is an experience in which one enters into. And that comes out in his writing. I think it's that same sort of thing.
The first work you've chosen is For the Life of the World, Sacraments and Orthodoxy. It outlines the Christian worldview and how it stems from liturgical experience of the Orthodox Church. Why does this work talk to him?
Why? In many ways, because of the first page of that book. I think it's brilliant. He begins by quoting Feuerbach, who says, we are what we eat. And of course, Feuerbach doesn't mean this in what Schmemann is meaning by it. And that's what's so brilliant. He's flipping Feuerbach. He's saying, yeah, you're right. If what we eat is dead, food is dead, we die. We're led on to death. And for Schmemann, he says, you are right. We are what we eat, but we eat the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is life, is God himself, is Jesus Christ. And therefore we live. And that sets the sort of tenor for the rest of the book. And so why is it so important? Because what he tries to do, and I don't think he's absolutely successful. I think it's a fantastic read. I think it's very challenging. But what he's trying to set out is a sacramental way of seeing reality. We could call it like a sacramental ontology. He wants us to realize that the world is full of meaning, that this life matters. Why does it matter? Because God is communicating to us through all things in this world, if we can have the eyes to see. And I think this is so significant and so vitally important for us as Catholics to understand our world, our existence is one in which we exist sacramentally, that the whole world is a type of communion with God. In Coet, it's limited, but if we do not understand the world as sacramental, as Schmemann would say, and I think he's right, we won't be able to understand the sacraments.
In For the Life of the World, Schmemann criticizes secularism. Is his liturgical theology also a social teaching, one rooted in the sacraments?
Yeah, because it gives, for Schmemann, he's going to say it gives us eyes to see. And I think what Schmemann sees in secularism is quite profound, because he says secularism is not what we think about now as 21st century thinkers, where our current state of things, where we feel a strange anomaly, people who believe in God. And Schmemann says, no, secularism is deeper than that. It's a whole way of seeing reality in which we think differently. And so he said America, and this he's writing, 1960s, 1970s. He's saying America is the most secular nation on earth, which seems like a strange claim, because at the time the majority of Americans are attending church on Sunday. And he says, well, actually, they're secularist not because they don't believe in God. They may believe in God, but they don't think in light of God the rest of the week. They only think in light of God on Sundays. And so they separate the sacred from the secular. And he says that is secularism. And so I think we have with his liturgical theology, a critique of the social and a way of engaging with the world. He's not that concerned about rubrics per se. He's concerned about, again, that spirit of the liturgy, what the liturgy says to us about reality, and again, through the eyes of liturgy, we begin to see the world aright. And so the liturgy teaches us to see God present in the world, to see the world as symbolic, to see reality as symbolic. And secularism does not see that. The world's just an end in itself.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.